with me, Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, prominent Malaysian economist, senior advisor at Hazanah Research Institute, former UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Sir, welcome to the show this morning. How have you been?
Very well, thank you. It is tricky to be isolated for such an extended period of time, something I'm not terribly used to. I'm a gregarious person like most of you. But it has been very challenging, but also very interesting. I've learned so much about so many things I would never otherwise have taken an interest in, ranging from astronomy to geology and so on.
Well, I'm assuming this is because you have a lot of time to read on other things as well, yeah?
Actually, I'm learning a lot from social media.
Okay. Aren't we all?
Dangerous thing.
Yeah, aren't we all? All right. So, Prof. Jomo, 2020 has been a roller coaster of a year. Can you give us an overall picture of how our economy fared? How much did our GDP shrunk due to COVID-19? How did our unemployment fluctuate? And are we beginning to show signs of recovery now?
Well, it's a tricky year to summarize because we went through so many different phases of the year. I think it's important to recognize that the stay-in-shelter lockdowns, which were imposed from March, were actually quite avoidable. It is true, of course, that in Wuhan city and around the three provinces around Wuhan city, there was a stay-in-shelter lockdown, but even China did not have a nationwide stay-in-shelter lockdown. Of course, it's a much bigger country. And Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Laos, and Kerala did not have stay-in-shelter lockdowns because of very successful early actions to contain the contagion. Unfortunately, much of the rest of the world did not do so. And so they have been stuck with stay-in-shelter lockdowns with all its implications. Stay-in-shelter lockdowns are usually combined with other measures to try to avoid transmission of the disease. And the result of this is a major disruption of economic activity. Two types of disruption. One type of disruption we've seen that internationally, for example, so-called supply chains have been disrupted. And domestically, sometimes such supply chains have been disrupted as well. But very importantly, many people are prevented by such stay-in-shelter lockdowns from carrying on with their normal economic lives and livelihoods. And the result of this, of course, is to deprive them of incomes. This deprivation of incomes, of course, means in turn that they spend much less. And because of the uncertainty about their own incomes, they tend to try to save as much as possible just in case. And so the result of it is a general slowing down of economies. So even after stay-in-shelter lockdowns are lifted, the MCO, we call it in this country, we find that people are still very cautious and careful about what they spend. They spend on what are considered to be necessities, but on very little else, especially if you're relatively low income and so on. So the result of it, of course, has been that you have a slowing down of the economy. Now, in some other parts of the world, many people were provided with supplementary incomes in the absence of their major incomes. And this happened for some sectors of the population in Malaysia. But the poorest people in Malaysia, at least the poorest people in urban areas, namely people who are involved in very petty, very small family businesses, as well as the daily rated workers who are paid according to how many days they work, rather than wages and salaries which are predetermined contractually. Those people have been very hard hit. And because they do not appear on many rosters, they were often not eligible for many of the temporary benefits which were introduced in this country through Prihatin. And then, of course, there were subsequently, we have the later measures which were introduced under what was called Penjana to try to revive the economy. But again, the focus was on certain sectors of the economy, certain types of economic activities. But there's a general sense that if you do not keep up what economists call liquidity, if people are not spending money, people are not earning money, people are not, that money seems to be unavailable, all this results in worsens the economic slowdown, worsens the recession. And so the challenge now is to try to avoid this recession from prolonging, from becoming a recession, a depression. And this is a major challenge, and how the government goes about doing this becomes very, very important. We saw that the budget was a partial effort in this direction, but in the view of many economists and others, not enough was done. We were not willing to be much bolder in terms of the kind of spending packages which are absolutely necessary to revive the economy. And so we do not have for many people, it was the biggest budget, and undoubtedly it is the biggest budget we have seen so far. But given the gravity of the situation, spending much more and particularly reaching the people who have been marginalized, who have been largely ignored, becomes absolutely necessary in this situation.
Right, but however, we are under CMCO now, where certain rules have been loosened a little bit. Prof. Jomo, do you think we're beginning to show a bit of signs of recovery now?
Yes, no, undoubtedly we have recovered. Once the MCO was over, people were allowed to go back to work and they resumed work. But obviously this is a much smaller economy. And so when you say, for example, let us say the economy, let me use the US figures because these are all published. During the second quarter, the US economy contracted by 33%. And in the third quarter, it grew by 33%. The percentage sounds the same. But actually, when you are starting from a bigger base in the second quarter and a smaller base in the third quarter, 33% still means that you're more than 10% short of what you were before. So all this, I think, is very important for us to take into consideration. It's not as if you have gone back to the status quo status quo before this. And so it is very important for us to recognize this. But very important part of it is what people call consumer confidence and producer confidence. If people do not feel that what they are producing, what they have produced traditionally is going to be in demand, they are not simply going to continue to producing it because you're going to have a lot of stock and so on and so forth. Also, very importantly, the continuing measures which are taken in Malaysia, we like to call them SOPs, mean that certain types of activities, for example, hospitality services where we would normally encounter each other physically much more. Those kinds of activities are understandably and quite correctly discouraged in the present situation. And this obviously affects demand. Only a few of us can switch to alternative means, for example, such as this webinar. Previously, I would have had to go to a studio or something like this. Now we're doing this virtually, and it is possible for certain types of activities to be substituted. Many such activities have been substituted. There's been tremendous innovation by ordinary people, and we should not assume that innovation is only something which happens when you have a intellectual property right or a patent or something like that. People are innovating all the time. People are adjusting all the time. One of the clerical officers in my office, for example, her brother runs a little sundry shop, and instead of people coming to his sundry shop, now he delivers, and he charges a little bit for delivery. People appreciate the service. They often order from him things which he himself does not carry, and so he does a little extra service. So it's people are adjusting. It's not as if people are not trying to adjust, but the scope for adjustment is often limited by people's means. In this case, he has a little van which he can take things around with, but other people may not even have a van. And then you have all these young boys who are riding motorcycles and trying to deliver goods, and you charge and you make money depending on how many deliveries you make. So people are going against the traffic, taking a lot of risks. And I know one other person whose husband, for example, has had already 2 major accidents over the last 9 months. So we see people putting themselves at considerable risk. So while we are understandably focused on COVID-19 per se, we have actually ignored many of our other health problems. The fact that, for example, many families, many children are drinking nothing, are eating mainly things like instant noodles. Obviously affects their nutrition in a very profound way. The fact that they no longer have access to the school supplementary nutrition programs affects their well-being in many important ways. So there's a great deal of things which are not really measured economically, which are very important to our well-being. And this, I think, is something which needs to figure much more in our discussions. People are suffering from ill health, mental health as well. And this is something which we don't, that people claim that there is a greater degree of violence against women at the household level. If true, this is something obviously of great concern, but we don't, much of this is not really well documented, understandably. And one attempt at a survey done by the Department of Statistics was not, although there was a promise of follow-up, we have not seen any follow-up of those surveys. So we really have very little and limited monitoring, and we do not seem to be learning enough, not only from other experiences and how others have coped often much better than we have with the challenges, but also from our own experience. I mean, for example, some states are responding very differently and seem to be doing a decent job of it, and so on. So we need to begin to understand, and rather than see the whole dealing with this pandemic as something which only involves a couple of ministries, the health ministry and the Home Affairs Ministry. What we need is an all-of-government approach. We need a whole-of-society approach where people are all involved and sharing information. Why, for example, after 9 months, we are still struggling with digitized education, when in fact most children do not have access. More than 90% of children do not have access to digital devices which allow them to have a digital education.
Right.
But more than 90% of households actually have television sets. You could actually supplement the number of television channels where you could have actually multiple educational TV, for example, or radio, and so on and so forth, where many more households have access.
Yeah.
There's a failure of innovation, and this is, and much of it has to do with a failure of government to respond adequately to the challenges. And of course, we had the coup d'etat at the end of February, which did not help either.
Right. So, this whole pandemic, this whole crisis that we face in the year 2020, it changes not just health, but everything else. So COVID-19 hit and the country went into MCO. We know businesses were badly affected. Can you give us a recap of the industries that suffered the most, Prof?
Well, I think the industries which have suffered the most are those which involve face-to-face relations. I think, for example, what is broadly referred to as hospitality services, hotels, many eating places, obviously people who are organizing large gatherings and so on and so forth. What convention services. All these people have basically had huge hits, and it will be quite some time before they can actually recover from this. Whether we are thinking about a status quo, returning to a status quo ante at some time in the future is also quite doubtful. I think, for example, as I was saying earlier to you, I have benefited so much from much more encounters of this type using digital services, and I would prefer actually that many webinars which are held not only in Malaysia but also internationally are continue to be held virtually as well. So it allows me, for example, I've been following much of the discussions, the detailed discussions of what happens before the new Biden administration takes over. And I'm very concerned, for example, about some of the things I hear, because it seems to suggest a return to business as usual before, rather than learning from the mistakes of the Obama administration and so on and so forth. So, things like this are actually, we have learned there are different ways of life, there are different ways of doing things. So certain things I hope we have learned from. So I think it's very too early to talk about going to a new normal. There's going to be, and the rate of innovation, the rate of automation, the rate of change is so rapid now that to talk about a normal implies a certain degree of staticness, of unchanging things. That I think we should stop language like, whether we return to business as usual, which is obviously not going to happen, but so to talk about a new normal as if it is something which is so predictable and so clear. I think we'll make things up as we go along, as we learn, and we all learn together. We all learn together. We learn from one another all the time. And this is no longer, thanks to this new digital means, we learn from practices which are taking place in other parts of the world as well. And, so I think there is some aspects of this unfortunate experience which has been truly liberating and innovative and so on. And I think, I do hope that a lot of this opens up. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that, this may well not be the last time we are subject to such a challenge. Already the Director General of the World Health Organization has warned the world that that we have had, reminded the world that we have had a number of viral epidemics in the recent past. Malaysians will remember things like Nipah virus and avian flu, Middle East respiratory syndrome, and SARS-1, and so on and so forth. All this within the lifetime of, certainly my own lifetime, and I suspect for anybody under 50, under 40, they can remember many of these things happening. They were not as infectious, and well, SARS-1 was more lethal. For those who were infected, it was much more lethal than COVID-19. But still, so I think we need to recognize that there are going to be major public health problems. It is very unfortunate that with the focus on COVID-19, we have often ignored many other problems. And maybe many of the people who have suffered from COVID-19, it involves respiratory systems. Maybe they have not been so badly affected, partly because of reduced air pollution during this COVID-19 period. So we need to begin to understand some of these correlations, the factors which are influencing, how well we do or how well we do not do, and so on and so forth. So, and I think we need to begin to re-examine many things about Malaysian society. For example, questions such as the heavy reliance on foreign workers. We can't bring foreign workers here, and there was an estimate by the former Human Resources Minister, Richard Ryott, in I think around 2014 or so, that there were 6.7 million foreign workers, of whom 2/3 were undocumented. Only 2.2 million were actually recognized in the labor force survey. In other words, 4.5 million were undocumented. Nobody knows what the numbers were at the beginning of the crisis, but for most people, returning to their homelands was not an option. So, especially after the so-called second wave in Singapore, it was predictable that foreign labor in this country would be very vulnerable to a so-called second wave or third wave or whatever wave you want to call it in this country. You know, they were living together in very congested circumstances and so on and so forth. So this was just a crisis beginning to happen. And then you have a minister coming along and saying, no, we are not going to extend services. You know, we have long had a commitment to universal health coverage. And this was reiterated by the authorities at the beginning. But then very soon after, another minister comes along and says, no. And so you basically drive these foreign workers underground. And they're very reluctant to cooperate with the authorities because of fear. So, you know, we often worsen the problem rather than help the problem. And now, unfortunately, the situation is really gone out of hand. But we really need to think about that issue. We really need to think about the funding for public health. We really need to think about a number of issues where we have not paid enough attention. It is frightening, for example, the number of people who in Malaysia who suffer from food-related or diet-related so-called non-communicable diseases. You know, there are problems like not enough blood iron, you know, not enough, and resulting in anemia and so on and so forth, and other problems such as diabetes and so on from excessive consumption of sugar and so on and so forth. These are avoidable. These are what in football parlance you would call an own goal, you know.
Yeah, it is, yes. And also going back to, you know, the plight of the people, there's COVID-19 has affected people's livelihoods, especially in terms of their spending power as well. Some have lost jobs. So the 6-month loan moratorium was one of the most talked about steps by the government to assist the people in dealing with COVID-19 financial issues. It ended in September 2020, and since then, banks have continued to offer targeted financial assistance. How long can this assistance be expected to continue, and how long should it go on for?
Well, that's a very tricky question. I don't think you can have a one-size-fits-all
Right,
answer on this, partly because there are different types of loans, as you know, and different types. Some loans involve collateral, where the banks feel quite secure. Some loans do not involve collateral, and so on and so forth. And there are loans for different purposes. Some loans are for consumption. You know, more than 80% of Malaysian households are in debt. You know, and then there are also those who borrow for investment, to invest in a particular new enterprise and so on and so forth. And that enterprise will be major. There may be major disruptions to those enterprises. But on the other hand, you might have those who borrow and are actually making quite a bit of money. For example, if I borrowed to get a little van, and that van is generating quite a bit of income thanks to my own efforts, I may be in a position to service that loan, and so on. So I think we have to really consider the situation as a whole. It's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all treatment of the problem. But it's understandable because Malaysians have become so used to borrowing, so used to being in debt over the recent decades, that it is, you know, this major disruption to your income means your major disruption to your ability to service your debt, and this, of course, is a huge problem. So this particular measure had tremendous appeal, but now that we are in a different situation, you know, there's nothing to stop banks from being abusive. But at the same time, I think banks are also very, very concerned about their bottom line. So I don't think necessarily being abusive for its own sake, but they are very, I mean, banks are in the business of making money. They are not in the, they don't lend to us because they love us. They lend to us because they think they can make some money from that particular transaction. So it's very difficult to have a one size fits all kind of an approach to this. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously many things to consider from this end and the other end as well when we talk about loan moratorium, but also the government announced several stimulus packages over the course of the year to boost the economy. Help us recap some of the biggest highlights from these packages. Have we seen any of these strategies starting to bear fruit just yet?
Well, I think, as I suggested earlier, I'm afraid that although it has been, by historical standards, a large stimulus package, frankly, there's not all that much which is a stimulus. Okay, when you get down into the details, there's hardly any stimulus element. And I'm not, partly because of my wariness about what is likely to be the future. I'm not, in and of itself, I'm not so worried about that you do not announce all kinds of jobs for the boys, which are, especially in our political context, is likely to be abused. I'm not terribly worried about that, but I do think you really need a stronger relief package because, as I suggested earlier, we have many people whose income have slipped between the cracks. You take, for example, a lot of people in Sabah and Sarawak, and even in Peninsula, who are who depend on tourism-related incomes. Those incomes have largely evaporated of COVID-19. What is being done to help them? What is being done to tide them over? We really need to think about these things sort of holistically. So, but at the same time, I think if there are other ways of providing relief, and one of the ways of providing relief, of course, is to have much more of the pre-heightened type measures, but spread out to reach much more of the people who are currently not reached because not formally employed and so on and so forth. People like to throw the word gig economy around a great deal, but I think long before the term came into fashion, there have been many people in Malaysia who actually live as if they are on a gig economy. In other words, they provide they have contracts, not contracts of labor, which is what an employee would normally have, but contracts for labor, and their rights are very limited as a consequence of this. Okay, and as we know, many people in the West, for example, in California, in Europe, there's been a tremendous pushback against the gig economy, against Uber, and so on and so forth. And so this celebration of the gig economy, I think, one has to take it with a bit of salt. It might, because of the nature of innovativeness and so on, it might be good in the short term, providing relief and so on and so forth. But whether or not it is the basis for human existence, for social existence in the longer term, is something which we need to think about very carefully.
Right on. Prof, budget 2021 was tabled in November. So we've heard about your comments about the budget as well. Obviously, you probably do not think that the budget will be able to meet the needs of the people in 2021. Am I right in stating that?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I think there's the people who are already covered by Prihatin plus will have some of their needs covered by the package.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there are still many people, and we're talking about some people say 30%, some people say 40% of the population who slip between the cracks. I don't know the precise numbers because this is a very imprecise kind of an issue. but it means that many, many people are going to slip between the cracks. More importantly, the limited nature of these benefits will mean that there will be a great deal of caution. People are going to be they're going to receive incomes and they're going to spend rather minimally, especially for the bottom 70% of the population.
Okay.
Only top 30% of the households in this country are in a position to save. Okay, the bottom 70% are not in a position to save, and of course the bottom 20% or so live in very abject conditions. But let's stick to the bottom 70%. So we have a situation where many of them will be very heavily dependent on whatever supplementary incomes are provided by the government. But it's not just a matter of supplementing the incomes. We need actual measures to create jobs, but not jobs of building things which are not needed. There are so many things which are needed. And this is a time when such innovation is desperately needed. One of the things, for example, I've been advocating for a long time is to have a food, a school meal, a full meal which is nutritious and safe. So much of our food in Malaysia, unfortunately, is not nutritious. And so many Malaysians, for example, suffer from micronutrient deficiencies, as well as and many of them also suffer from food-related non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and so on and so forth. Many people are kind of overweight in this country, and a smaller percentage are obese, and this is hugely problematic. We waste a lot of money, for example, on air conditioning offices. Offices need to be better designed. There needs to be much more energy-saving measures. It's no point having a central air conditioning system and then windows which are open, letting out the air conditioning from the building. So you have a lot of problems which involve energy saving at the building level, and again, no one size fits all. All these kinds of things need to be done. You need to provide food which is safe and nutritious, and so many people, especially in urban areas, but also in rural areas, children are not getting a nutritious meal at all per day. So one meal which provided by the school with the consultation from the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, can help to arrange so that the food is supplied. So it benefits farmers, and we get away from this notion of food security, which focuses primarily on what do you call it, on rice growing. Whether we are growing enough rice or not. This rice supplies is going to be a problem, undoubtedly. But forcing people to grow rice when the incomes are so poor is also a problem. But they can earn much more from growing vegetables. You can grow vegetables much more intensively, and you can by having a demand from the schools, you can ensure that these vegetables and fruits, for example, are grown in ways which do not involve toxic pesticides and so on and so forth. Maybe the vegetables will come out not looking as beautiful as they do in the supermarkets. But we have to get away from this kind of fixation with the superficial and really think about our nutrition. We cannot be concerned about food safety only when our food exports get rejected by other countries. We have to think about it. So there are many things which are important. So budget 2021 looks at some of these issues, but in my mind, a kind of for example, we're going to supply more milk. Let's face it, 95% of the milk supply in this country is imported. So it doesn't help Malaysian farmers. We can get calcium, we can get protein from other sources, Malaysian grown sources. Um, uh, and this can be done much more intensively. So they become, it's not so land dependent, where you need huge areas of land. You can, for example, cultivate mushrooms. Mushrooms can be quite healthy. There are certain kinds of mushrooms. Of course, there are other mushrooms which can be quite dangerous. There are many sources of food which are healthy, which will augment and enhance Malaysians' well-being. And we need to think about very, very differently. Likewise, there are a number of industries which need a little bit of a nudge, a little bit of encouragement for Malaysians to do much better in. For example, the two which immediately come to mind. Malaysia is the single largest source of photovoltaic solar panels imported into the US. But not a single Malaysian company is involved. They are all foreign companies which happen to be here, and it's not that complex. I can assure you. I happen to know a little bit about this, and it is actually something which is very doable. Many of the Chinese companies which now dominate only started up about a decade or slightly over a decade ago. So we need to begin to think out of the box. Malaysia introduced Malaysia introduced palm oil biodiesel more than 3 decades ago, but we've hardly gone anywhere with it. Whereas Indonesia has moved further, and the European Union has almost 100% biodiesel, as a requirement. But they are using much more expensive vegetable oils than Malaysia can offer, or other palm oil producers can offer. So we really need to think out of the box, become much, much more innovative, and not sort of aim for, flying cars and this kind of pie in the sky kind of stuff.
Right. And also, in an effort to help the people some more, the government permitted qualified EPF account holders to withdraw up to 10,000 ringgit of funds from their accounts. Well, the worry is taking out the money, it would affect the funds. Was this the right move? Should they be allowed to withdraw a larger amount even?
I'm a little torn on this. I mean, undoubtedly, Malaysians should be provided by saving for old age. Okay, Malaysian life expectancy now is somewhere in the region of about 76 years, and for males it is less. It's 74. For women it is 78. But unfortunately, in Malaysia, the last 9.5 years on average is in poor health.
Yeah.
So the incomes from something like EPF become extremely important. But we also know that an EPF covers less than half the working population.
Okay.
EPF right now will provide an income of about above the poverty line for less than 20% of its account holders. Okay, because many Malaysian workers are earning so little that they will get so little. So the EPF is hardly a guarantee of well-being in old age for the vast majority of EPF holders, who constitute, as I said, more than 80% of EPF account holders. And then consider that that many of them, that many other Malaysians do not even have EPF accounts. So we are talking about less than 10% of the population. Okay, and then you have the other problem right now, where many people are in dire straits. They need emergency access. They need access to funds, and because of the difficulties of access to funds for poor people without much collateral to offer and so on and so forth, it is very difficult for them to have access to other funds. So having access to their own savings via EPF is an easy way out for the government. After all, it's their money. It's not the government's money. It's their money.
Right.
So it's an easy way out for the government, but it is a problem because their lives are going to be adversely affected in the longer term, and this is something for us to consider. And the people who are going to find it worthwhile to withdraw 10,000 or whatever the amount is, are probably going to be the better off anyway. So it is a very complex issue, and I don't think, again, that a one-size-fits-all answer is appropriate in the circumstances.
Right. And recently, the World Bank predicted that Malaysia's economy will bounce back in 2021. It was reported. What do you think will be the best way for us to claw our way back in a post-pandemic environment? And what factors could potentially hamper our journey towards recovery?
Well, let's face it, after the MCO, the economy is already so-called bouncing back, right?
Right.
But the Americans have an expression, dead cat bounce, okay?
Yeah.
You can drop a dead cat and it might seem to bounce, but there's really no bounce, okay? So what are we talking about, okay? So the World Bank may be right, may be wrong. It's like a statement, okay? It's stating the obvious. You don't need to know very much to say that the economy is going to do better in the second half of 2020 compared to the first half, and the economy should do better after this. I don't think you need to be terribly to have much foresight to say that. But I think there is a question of given that it's a new world we are returning to, not in fundamental ways, but there are important changes. What does it mean? What is Malaysia's place in this under this new sun? And we have additional problems which are not due to health, which are due to the fact that, for example, under President Trump and under Prime Minister Abe, the two of them were asking their companies, American and Japanese companies, to get out of China. But were they coming to Malaysia? Maybe a couple, but most of them were not coming to Malaysia. Most of them went back to their own countries, which was the intent of Trump and Abe's instructions. And a few have gone to Vietnam, to Indonesia, and so on. Malaysia, unfortunately, has done rather poorly in this regard. And we are, of course, quite intimately tied up with the US, with China, the Chinese economy, our major trading partner today, unlike, say, 3 decades ago. And this basically has huge implications. So what Trump and Abe did against China actually affects all China's suppliers as well, including us. So it is a problem which is not due to COVID-19, it is due to the politics of the period. And I think it's very important for us to disentangle a lot of this. At the same time, I think it is naive to believe that somehow or other signing more free trade agreements is going to magically resolve a lot of these problems. Some of them might help at the margin, but many of them are actually going to put us in worse off positions. You take, for example, the so-called CPTPP. That is going to make us much more vulnerable to foreign investors who are going to be gouging as much profits as they can from our situations. So I would say that, let's be very, very circumspect. Let's learn some lessons from the past and not just get out of the frying pan into the fire.
Right. Although everything's all still, very fluid, the things that has happened, the announcements that has been made by the government in helping the people, and also how to move forward. Now, what about anticipation of the Malaysian economy? How do you anticipate it will perform in 2021? Or is it really something tough to actually look into even?
Quite honestly, you are asking me to become an astrologer. This is not astronomy. This is astrology.
Yeah. Okay.
I think to be realistic, I think there are many determinants. What happens at the global level is important. How will Biden behave? How will Suga in Japan behave? Suga has got about 1 year to get confirmation as party leader. Whether he will even survive that after that 1 year is anybody's guess. So we have a lot of uncertainty. You have a huge revival of what I call ethno-populism, which contributes to this kind of bogus nationalism of people like Narendra Modi and Bolsonaro in Brazil and so on and so forth. All this it means that many of these economies are not interested. They're looking very, very narrowly at their own interests, understandably. It basically means that we have to do much innovation and so on. And unfortunately, for more than 2 decades, Malaysia has been in the doldrums ever since the Asian financial crisis. So, we were doing quite well in the early and mid 1990s, and we've had lackluster growth since then, worsened by the global financial crisis, and now, made much worse by the pandemic. So recovering from this is something which is likely to happen to some extent, but it is the robustness of the recovery which concerns me.
Prof, finally, let's talk about things. A lot of things that we have been discussing so far are the things that are out of the people's hands. What are some things that you can tell us on what to do in the road to recovery? You did say it will recover, but it's all about how robust it goes, and also your hopes for 2021.
My hope, frankly, is for uh, um, that we should quickly get over the kind of ambiguity about vaccines. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. Okay, I don't, but I am concerned about the fact that too many people have put so much hope on the vaccine, and we are rushing into using and vaccines for all kinds of reasons, including the possibility of private profit, including the possibility of using it to make a political statement about who you're aligned with in the world today, and so on and so forth. Things like this are really bothering me. At the same time, there is the hope that there will be relatively simple solutions. The Australian team from Monash University published a paper in April this year about a Japanese drug which has been available for a long time, which seems to have had 100% success in terms of treating the disease. But I hope that there will be a simpler solution out. That's one of my hopes, that we can go back to a less socially estranged life, where we will have much more social interactions, but we will also learn from this whole unfortunate experience. We will learn all the lessons which we need to be learned, and I've already suggested several which have not received the attention which I believe they deserve. But there are many more which I have not even mentioned or elaborated on, which need to be learned. At the same time, I think we should recognize that many people, ordinary people, are actually quite innovative, and we should have much more space and room to harness that innovation on the part of ordinary Malaysians. It doesn't mean that all that innovation is necessarily good, or if all the innovation is necessarily safe. I talked about the all these people working to deliver food and so on, and they're taking great risks. There are many other problems like that. We need to be careful and circumspect, but we need also to think about ordinary people, the welfare of ordinary people, of ordinary families, and not just about the elite. Because we have a discourse in this country which is very much dictated by elite considerations, whether it's the political elite or the business elite, or including the international elite. They are the ones who dictate a lot of what happens in this country. We need to recognize that people all over the world are very innovative, can be very innovative if given half the opportunity, but there need to be guidelines to harness that. And this, to me, is a great hope for the time to come. Obviously, I do hope that we will have a revival of economic activity, but it cannot be on the same old basis. Basis of budgetary allocations which are skewed in particular ways. It cannot be on the basis of depressing the wages and working conditions for ordinary workers, whether Malaysian or foreign, and so on and so forth. We need to see the interconnectedness of our lives. The Malaysian workers are adversely affected by the depressed working conditions which foreign workers experience, for example. All this needs to be understood, generally appreciated. We need to acknowledge this and be able to talk about it, because if there are still millions of foreign workers in this country who are illicit, you can't just wish away the problem. You need to have some kind of medium-term strategy to deal with these kinds of issues. I would say that I hope 2021 is the year of progressive innovation.
All right, Prof. Jomo, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning. You've given us great insight. We hope for the best for the future. I would like to wish you a very happy new year to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, and thanks to your listeners too. Happy New Year to everybody.